everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10 Foot Pole, a podcast dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 23. Today, our guest is the Pastor Rebecca Boardman, who serves as the Lutheran Campus Ministries pastor at the University of Arizona in Tucson, Arizona.
Hey. Hi, AJ. Glad to be here.
Rebecca is a returning guest from Season 1, so it's good to have you. It's good to have you back.
I'm glad to be back with an old friend talking about a new text.
Yeah. Well, she says that because I told her, I was like, hey, I want to talk about this. And she's like, ugh, I've literally never preached about this or anything. So I have to do homework.
I did say that, yes.
Which, you're not the only person that said it to me recently. And I said, I understand. And that's kind of the point of the podcast, right? No one talks about these things. This, we're going to read the Acts text for Sunday, May 14th, for those that are going to go to church. And I'm guessing at, most churches, they're going to read this and then they're going to move on. No one's going to say anything about it. So
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, maybe let's see what we can inspire some preaching about it. Sometimes that happens.
It does.
I did this whole thing about the Psalm for Palm Sunday. And I said this whole thing, and I was like, listen, no one's going to preach about this. It's Palm Sunday. You're going to hear, probably the whole full passion. You might not even hear the Psalm because they start to cut things out. And that's easily the first thing to go, right?
Absolutely.
And I had someone text me when that came out and was like, OMG, this is amazing. I was planning on going rogue and preaching about the Psalm. So at least one congregation did get to hear about it. Anyway, so we could inspire some new stuff. Also, I love having you back. And as Rebecca was setting up her new fancy microphone, I was thinking back when you were on here the first time, you had half of a headset or half of a pair of headphones and was just holding it to your face.
I think we were about 10 minutes in before I realized my microphones didn't even have a microphone. Right?
I'm just using my headphones and it's not.
No, it's not. I'm just gonna be out here representing the Android community, knowing that not everyone. Yes, I work with young adults. I just need to remind them.
Speaking of Android, when I first met you, you still had an iPhone, but even at that time, it was years out of date. This was an ancient iPhone, even within the day. But my favorite part was that you just had a shell of a case on it. It wasn't even connected to your phone anymore. You didn't have the whole phone case on there. It just kind of sat inside of it. I was like, why do you have that?
I do not. I don't even remember that because it was okay. It was just okay. So we've now established I'm not a tech lover. It's purely functional in my life. But I would not be able to talk with a dear friend in South Carolina if there wasn't it. So true. I love that.
You do fine. You make it work. That's what counts.
I make it work. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Right. Let's break into some Acts. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about Acts 17, verses 22 to 31. Again, for those that are going to go to church, you'll hear this on Sunday, May 14th. If not, I hope you enjoy learning something a little bit new today, because this is going to be something we haven't talked about at all. So here we go. I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. And I would like to make one pronoun disclaimer before I start reading. What we're going to read is mostly a quotation of Paul giving a speech in Athens. And Paul is talking about God and uses exclusively male pronouns because that's how it was written. And generally when we talk about God a lot, I will take out the pronoun and just put God in. And I practiced doing that in my head, and it got really weird. And also I like to use they, them for pronouns for God, which also got a little confusing in the text. So I'm giving the disclaimer to say that I am going to read the male pronouns for God, just so we're all clear what is being said, but that it makes my eye twitch along with you, for listeners that are like, wow, I can't believe she said his that many times. But that there's just a lot there, and it was a lot to try to manipulate those, if that makes sense. Okay, that's for folks that do care deeply about that. I also care deeply, so I just wanted to share. Anyways, here we go. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, Athenians, I see how extremely spiritual you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, To an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it. God, who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor, or another translation, or one blood, he made all peoples to inhabit the world, the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the place where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps fumble about for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art or imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So this is from Acts, and just a reminder that Acts is kind of a part 2 of the Gospel of Luke, that it is by the same author, and it's like one continuous story, right? We got the Acts Luke together, which I really appreciate. This is honestly, like, I've always Luke's been my favorite gospel, and I'm not really sure for what specific reason, because honestly my best preaching comes from Matthew, but really I think it's because it has the sequel, right? That this author said, okay, this is what you need to know, and here's the rest of the story, right? I like that there's, you get more information, right? We have a season 2 that comes out with it. So to say that, and so to remember in as we read and talk about this, that this story is about Paul, but it is not written by Paul, the unknown author of Luke Acts.
Yeah, as I was reading,
important to recognize.
I do too, and for all our friends out there, that I'm imagining if you're following AJ, that you're tracking this already, but this even just in English, you don't even have to dig into the Greek. I think it's kind of obvious from the syntax, right?
Yes.
That this is not in the style.
Well, yeah, and if you follow the various things that Paul says as narrated by the author of Luke Acts, there's many contradictions between what Paul writes and in the authenticated Pauline letters. Clearly it's a little different, that whoever wrote this knew Paul, right, but had very different theology.
I kind of love that you asked a campus pastor to join you on the podcast today, because we operate more than our parish colleagues in the public square,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's what's happening in this story today. And
yeah, he's
there's
not
a
like
part
doing something specific, right? Like he is not in Athens. So this story should really start at verse 16, right? So Paul is in Athens because he was with Silas and Timothy, and they have work to finish up in Thessaloniki, but like Paul had to leave for his own safety, so like people like kind of forced him to go to Athens. So he's just hanging out here until he can catch back up with his colleagues before moving on to Corinth. He's not here for any real official purpose. And yet he finds himself, as he always does in these situations.
I just kind of have this image of like, okay, so we're backpacking Europe together, and Paul and Silas are like, deuces, we are going to go do the real thing.
Yep.
We need you just to lay low for a while. We'll catch up later. And then here's young Paul, can't help himself, finds himself in Athens, and he's just thinking, I am like Socrates, right? And I'm going to engage the people in this public square.
Because I'm sure that Paul, so he was probably, doing the touristy thing a little bit. And as I was walking around your city, I noticed some of these things you see. I would like to address them with you.
Yes. He's
doing that thing you're absolutely not supposed to do as like a tourist, let alone someone who should be laying low, right? Like, don't go and tell people their stuff is wrong.
Yeah, I don't think laying low was his vibe. I don't think it was his, even if it's real Paul or fake Paul, I think that is consistent in the character. So
that was recorded properly.
Yes, that part is real.
So what's happening is Paul is attempting, and I do air quotes as like his real attempt to stay low. So I'm sure he's out and about in the town, totally saying things in that like, that everybody knows that person. And I can say this because typically in a group of people out in public, I am that person. That doesn't matter who I'm talking to, whether they're right next to me or across the park, everyone can hear what I'm saying. Rebecca's laughing because we've
no, this never happened. Never in a crowded restaurant. Like, where's AJ? Oh, okay, we know where she is.
So I imagine Paul is in this situation and he makes some comment about something that all of a sudden these philosophers are like, listen, we got to take this. What is this guy talking about? So they, make him come out and explain what is going on. So they take him to the Areopagus, which I'm sure I am saying incorrectly, which is, like as Rebecca said, sort of like a gathering place. It is a prominent rock formation or other ancient authority, which it is. And at the time, it was also like sort of like a governing kind of place that they would talk about things. And so they're like, listen, we believe in stoicism and all these other kind of things. What is it that you're over here walking around our city rambling about? And like make him explain. And so then he gets this speech.
Yeah, I think it is also interesting because they said like he's kind of trying to meet them at their own at their level, like it's unusual because you wouldn't think like, oh, okay, I'm gonna go right to the town and like, I don't know, engage this high stakes interaction between the apostle and intelligentsia, right, of this famous city. But this kind of I'm a storyteller, and so I love the story that this is creating, right, this picture that it's painting for us, because we have no concept kind of of talking about pluralism kind of in this early church lens, but in our modern world, that's very much a part of our daily life. And so what can we learn here? What is cringy? What, right? I think that there's parts of this we should dig into.
I think you're right. I think for the last, especially a few hundred years where most Christians were especially isolated by other Christians, this may not have stuck home as much as like I think that we can understand it today. So what we have here, so Paul is walking around, he says, I see in one of your idols. And like, I underline that term because it hit me interesting. How many times do we see idols, these false idols in the Bible, right? Like even part of the 10 Commandments, right? Like we don't have these false idols. But to think about, I mean, that this was their religion, right? So like, well, we have in our Christian Bible, the term that uses this as idols, he's having a conversation with people like, to them, this is their gods.
Right. But I think there's we're coming at it from different angles because this is not a monotheistic religion. And so when we're talking about like kind of ancient mythology, there's lots of layers, there's incorporation of lots of different traditions. There's kind of a take it or leave it idea. And so, and then people are kind of crafting their own kind of religious understanding
based on the gods that they like, which ones they want to worship. Yeah.
Right. And so I don't know that it came across as offensive from the beginning. And I kind of like that he zeroed in on the unknown God part. Now, as the readers today, we realize that in verse 16, before this passage, it says, Paul was waiting for them in Athens, and he was deeply distressed to see the city full of idols. So we know that, right? That's where the attitude that he has going into this. But as we look at the story, the frame.
No, I think his framework is good too. So something about the unknown God. So there are translations that like capitalize it, like this is a formal name. It is the unknown God. And some guy actually in the early 20th century. So actually kind of like, theorized that, but it wasn't necessarily that this is an official like unknown God, but that other historians say that there were altars to unnamed gods, as in like people were praying to this God, but they didn't actually know what their name was because that God had not yet revealed themselves to the people. And so from that lens, Paul's kind of saying like, listen, there's this unknown God. I'm telling you who that God is. So I think he is speaking within their framework, which I was actually kind of impressed with. Again, this isn't like what we would understand as Paul's traditional style of like telling people about God, right? So he's coming in a totally different kind of direction, and it's a lot, I don't know, he meets them a lot closer to where they're at in this conversation than I think we would normally understand Paul to be.
Right. I think just again, from our 21st century lens, this is not an embodiment of accompaniment as we, right? This is not how we share the faith currently in our ELCA theology. And so it's hard, it's cringy.
But it's not, I don't think it's as bad as some of Paul's other speeches.
No, not at all. When we get to the end, I think obviously there's the deep focus on repentance. I do wonder though, even though like I deeply believe and abide in accompaniment, that in case you're unaware, like in all of the public university campuses across the country, there is a traveling circuit of preachers that are there many days of the year, and there's traveling brigades, and then they are preaching a rhetoric of really of hate and judgment in their lens of Christianity, and that makes me sad that is the loudest Christian voice in the public sphere. And so this, I don't think he's doing that here. And I wonder where the places in which that we can kind of engage in dialogue. Right. And now I wouldn't say that this is necessarily a dialogue, because he does have the agenda to convert. Right. And so if that's on the table, then that's not really a mutual dialogue.
Which, as you said, is, I don't think Paul has any mutual dialogues. It's not that, I actually think this may be a tangent, but just a note about Paul and sort of his style and his letters and his theology. And some of the really terrible things that kind of come out of some of the things that Paul has written is, I don't know. I think sometimes there are places where you have to decide, are you following Jesus or are you following Paul? And I say that because like all of the New Testament terrible quotes that people like to bring up to throw in, you know, women's faces, LGBT faces, whose ever faces, they're usually coming from Paul. And so, and by usually I think almost exclusively. And so for that, it's for us to decide, like, for people who really like that is their front, this is their version of Christianity, is putting those things on the forefront. You know, to them, I say, like, well, where did we leave Jesus behind?
Yeah. Well, and I have always abided by the kind of the traditional understanding that, like, we don't say praise to you, O Bible, right? We say praise to you, O Christ, after we say a lesson, the reading of the gospel. And we do believe that the Bible is the cradle that holds Christ, right? Opposed to it being an idol itself, right? And so anyone, I think that's listened to AJ's podcast for more than 5 minutes knows that kind of all of scriptures is not one voice. There's multiple authorship, right? And it's conflicting, it's complicated, and it needs to kind of be understood within the larger context and the larger narrative. And so there's just it astounds me, those that are the most literalist about the Bible often have the least understanding of how it came to be, and frankly, even what it says in the original Greek, right? So that's as someone who grew up in the Bible Belt, that is a frustration that I've had for most of my life.
It's something that scares me to death, like every day when we go out places now, because I've had like a certain understanding of this area of the country, right? And I'm having to, like, one, unlearn things, but also have a new way that I view the world.
What does that mean?
It means that I have to, it's both simultaneously understanding that the South isn't as horrible and racist as I, in my brain, have always thought. And also still having a select understanding of caution for the different louder voices that are here.
There's just so much polarization in our country right now, right?
And that's part of it too, that I think that it may not even have anything to do with what part of the country that we're currently located in. That you're going to hear and see more of that. And to be honest with you, out of, you know, at least what the news tells me every day about things that are happening all over our country, it's pretty mild here, even comparatively to my home state of Iowa, right? So I think that we're just in a new era of what is apparently okay to say. And I can't decide if I like it or dislike it, because part of me is like, well, people didn't used to say that. I was like, people just used to think that. They just didn't say it out loud because it was impolite. So is it worse now that we do or not? Unclear. Because, you know, sometimes it's nice to know, like, oh, that is just where that person's really coming from. I may be we're totally off track here, but
we're off. Yeah. Well, we can really get into it. I happen to be in Iowa on the day of the presidential election for Miss AJ's ordination, and I can remember that. Right? Do you remember that?
Well, right, because there was an election and we didn't actually find out who the president was until like 5 days later. I do remember that
Yeah.
now.
Okay. So I just am remembering just like how contentious Iowa felt in that space, and it was unexpected. So when I think about idolatry, I'm thinking in our modern context, I'm thinking about statues though, right? And like why is it so important to keep certain, like there's still an argument, right, about Confederate statues and whether or not they should stay in the public space. And what does that mean? What does that represent? And I think it's interesting to think about what holds the public imagination and belief system and how, like what we regard as sacred.
Well, I'll take it one step further and even just talk about brands, right? Like anytime you walk around, like you see various brands, you have a certain kind of image in your mind and the different things that they're associated with, right? Like something very, very, very contemporary that, it's still, real fresh is the issue with Bud Light right now, right? Like, so all of a sudden, because do you know what happened with Bud Light?
I don't.
That's fine. You don't live in Missouri anymore.
I don't live in Missouri anymore. I know.
Drinker, so
read me in. What's going on?
So sometimes Bud Light does these like one-off cans for like influencers and things like that, just to kind of promote and like deal with like they do it with like thousands of different like kind of like semi-famous or influencers, people like that. They did this one-off can with a transgender woman, and she posted a thing about it on Instagram. All of a sudden, all of these right-wing, super conservative people just like freaked out and said, well, we don't support Bud Light anymore. And like Kid Rock made this video of himself with an AR-15 shooting cans of Bud Light. He was so upset that they would put a trans woman on a can. And for the record, it was one singular can. They put her face on the can and sent it to her. They didn't put her face all over Bud Light cans that they were selling all over super red states or anything like that. It was a singular can. There's a lot of things Bud Light could have done. First of all, so like there's like a bunch of bars in the South and stuff like that said we're not selling Bud Light anymore. They lost millions of dollars in sales over this one can, and mostly, honestly, I think it was all Kid Rock's fault. Like he freaked out, so then everybody else freaked out. Sarah Huckabee Sanders started like making koozies that look like the Bud Light logo, but it's like real women something. Like all of it, all of these people went nuts over this trans woman having this one pleasant experience with Bud Light. Bud Light could have done a lot of things, in the wake of this. This is what Bud Light chose to do. Made a statement that says, well, we don't mean to divide, we like to bring people together. Never came out in support of the trans woman. Didn't really deny her, didn't anything. This is what they did. They kind of threw her to the wolves, said, well, we're sorry, we didn't mean to make people upset. And then they put the two people on the marketing team that made this decision on leave. So there was an opportunity to do something.
Oh, yeah.
So right. I guess when I think about like, I think this kind of capitalism and these sort of like marketing things, like they kind of take over our entire lives, right? And so like what brands are you associated with, right? Like that becomes a thing. Even just think about the cars that people drive. Like I drive a Nissan. That's not as cool as, driving a Lexus or a Volvo or something, right? Like it's, I think that these kind of idols is what permeates into our lives the most in our capitalist society. So like all of a sudden, because Bud Light is now associated with that woman, you can't be associated. It's
it is it's like a binary understanding, right? That there's good and evil, that there's one right way and one wrong way. And I think all of society is far more complex. And to bring it back to the text, like we have a God that's far more complex than that. And I think we need to find better ways as people of faith to live and embody a God that personifies that, right? And so I can remember years ago, like having a student that was really involved in the social justice office at the university. And her friends found out that she was also really involved in Luther Campus ministry. And they're like, how can you be a Christian and be a leader in our social justice office? And she says, it's because I'm a Christian that I'm a leader in this office.
Yeah.
And it was like a super secular campus. And they were kind of shocked and surprised and horrified. But then it created this opportunity that was really authentic to have a conversation about. She's like, well, actually, my faith does support that women are equal and that we need to be advocates for the poor and the oppressed, and that LGBTQ people are fully human and part of creation, and they need to be respected and da da da. Anyway, and so she found a way, and so I think we just need more opportunities to live our faith in the public sphere. And connect the dots, because people are hungry for a better story. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think people are just, what is
That's my 14-year-old Pekingese snoring under the table. Do you know? What do you?
Palo.
Okay.
I thought I thought someone was like outside grilling like all on your street.
No, that's just an old man Palo. Just come on, Bubba.
Oh, sorry, Palo. I didn't mean to interrupt your nap. It was very distracting.
Yes.
I think people are just. I think people are hungry for like some good news, but I think people are just so tired of what they are hearing, right? That like aversion to like, where is the good news?
Mm-hmm. Do you know who Father Greg Boyle is?
My name's familiar, actually.
His book is Tattoos on the Heart, and he's a Jesuit priest in Los Angeles that, like, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago started this homeboy
Tattoos on the Heart
industries. Yeah, it's really good. And he came to town to anyways, I heard him speak, and I read his book a long time ago, and just I was cranky going into it. I thought, oh, what could this Catholic priest say that I would actually really resonate with? And it's an unbelievable story about how he helped. He was in like the heart of gang territory in Los Angeles, and then they started all of these different work programs and bakeries and tattoo parlors and all these kinds of things, so that the folks would have kind of a path out of the gang life. And anyway, so when he was talking, it just was such a holy time. Like I maybe heard him, I don't know, maybe a month ago. And he just was talking about the lethal absence of hope in our world. And and that just phrase has stuck with me, because he said, homeless people don't run out of money, they run out of relationships. And we have this pandemic of loneliness. And that is why people join gangs. And I think you can cut out gangs and insert that's why people joined blank. That's why people turn to alcoholism. That's why people turn to or stay in unhealthy relationships. That's why people, fill in the blank of any number of things. The lethal absence of hope.
Yeah. I think so, as Paul is, sort of giving his speech, right, that he's evangelizing, because it's what his big deal is, right? When they get that, like, listen, it's about repentance, it's about changing, coming to God, right? But in his appeal to them was sort of like to say, hey, there's this unknown God that I want to tell you about. He's meeting them on an intellectual level for them to understand. But I think what's about this God that he's describing here, the God that made everything, there's the Lord of heaven and earth, that like doesn't need your shrines, doesn't need to be served by human hands, right? Like this God is the one that's giving you breath and life and all the things that you have. I think part of his message here and what I think probably stood out to them, and especially those in the crowd that did convert based on his story, is he is giving them a hope. You had mentioned briefly before we started recording about, the various gods that they would have had and what we now call Greek mythology, that again, I just said, right, that was just their religion at the time. We have since decided that it's mythology. But that their gods had more human characteristics, that they were spiteful, that they needed these things, that they were just so much different than this God that he is trying to introduce them to.
Right. I think that's huge. And I'm always reminded, I don't know what it is about the teen or like the preteen mind that's fascinated by Greek mythology, but it's just kind of all around me. So I think with my nephews are just entranced by these stories. And I can remember, 5th, 6th grade being like that too, right? And it just captures your imagination and it's incredible. But again, so how I think the ultimate test of who is your God to stake your life on, right? And for me, that is a just and fair universal God, right?
It's
and
trust, right? Like,
oh, absolutely.
You talk about some of the gods that they would worship. Like, do you trust them to take care of you, to have your back, right? Is that,
I mean, these are stories of gods who ate their children, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that there's like any number of so there's really vengeful qualities, there's jealousy, there's anger, and one could say that that's a lot of what we see in the Old Testament God as well, but I think that that's kind of an oversimplification of how we understand the Hebrew scriptures, right? And so I think that there's a lot more there's a lot more there. And so anyway, so I think when we're talking about the pantheon of gods that lower G gods that are existing kind of in the world, then how do we and also I think he's trying to drive home the point that this isn't like a pick and choose faith, right? And that if you are to abide by the God of our God of creation, that is also not just a pursuit of the mind, but also the soul, right? And faith is lived with your feet. And we don't quite get there here in Acts, but we know that that's part of the whole of the story, is that this is not, God doesn't just want your money, right? And doesn't want a fancy statue. That our God wants us to lead transformed, reconciled lives. And there's a cost that comes with that. That's frankly, gold and silver is easier at times, right?
Yeah, almost always.
I mean, really, it just, the path of forgiveness is hard and long, right? And the path to reconciliation is hard and long. But that is the life that God has called us to lead in community. Investing again and again in community is the hardest thing that we can do, I believe, as humans. And back to that kind of that toxic loneliness that exists in our society. We've never been more digitally connected and socially disconnected, right? And so we need each other.
Well, I think it goes back to, what is the offering of this God, right? Like this is, it's sort of the same thing we talked about recently when it came to like picking between Jesus and Barabbas, sort of like, they wanted some revolution, a violent insurrection, right? And this guy was offering it over Jesus, right? So let's let this guy out. He's going to do what we want. So for us to continually, again, understand how our God operates. And especially, as we have seen, through the life and the works of Jesus, right? That's not the way that God functions, right? Like God is hope and trust and peace, and that, in comparative, I think, to when you're living in a place where your gods eat their own babies and your gods, I went down this rabbit hole of looking into some of them because, this is the Mount of Ares, right? Who got in trouble because he killed some other god for raping someone else. And it's like, this isn't the behavior of, a deity, right? And so for Paul to say none of those things, like that's not what this God is about. This God who is the God, the creator of everything in life and the sustainer, right? Like functions totally differently and wants something totally differently from you than just gold, silver, praise.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Trisha Hershey and Rest is Resistance?
I have also have heard of it.
Okay. Oh, she's amazing. And she's calling herself the Nap Bishop. You can follow her on Instagram. She's incredible. And she has this wonderful book, Rest is Resistance. And Walter Brueggemann has a similar thing called Sabbath is Resistance. And I think that's another thing that I talk about a lot with my students. And we practiced Nap Chapel this week as a reminder, because part of our, I think, work is one of the ultimate gods. Capitalism is an ultimate god in our society, right? And so our God calls us into a life of dedication to the neighbor and to the world, but also that rest is a part of the cycle, and that Sabbath is sacred and our bodies are sacred, and that we are not meant to the grind culture that is pervasive, particularly with younger people, that is not a whole life, right? That is not how God calls us to be restored, and that our value is not on our production to society, right? And so I think that that's a gift that
that's a big one.
Right. That our God teaches us, and I think that needs to be echoed again and again, because it's very easy to, it's so much bigger than work-life balance, right? I mean, it's just like a constant.
Well, yeah, and it's hard in sort of, I think it's hard in our balance of what, and especially in the church world, right? Of like wanting to, there's always people that we need to serve. There's always, that I think that we could get. Pastors are some of the worst workaholics that I've ever met.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so then how is that modeling for your community? Right. What that means, right? And so like, how do we have healthy boundaries? I think it's taken me a long time to get there, and it's a daily struggle. But also like, what is enough, right? And ultimately that for us to be healthy leaders and healthy community, it's not about how many resources we can push out and how, all those things, but it is about the meaningful, restored humanity. So
it's balance. Like there's holy work, but also like if we don't take care of ourselves, okay, so twofold. Like one, like it's just like you have to take care of yourselves in order to take, put your mask on before you help your neighbor. That sort of mentality, but at the same time also recognize that we too are worthy beings of being cared for. And part of that is self-care.
Yeah. It's so much bigger. I feel like self-care kind of can have like a buzzword and kind of have I was talking with a colleague about this, like there's a whole kind of industry, especially like in Tucson with the fancy spas and all the, right? That's kind of around self-care. And so Sabbath keeping is about intention and simplicity. And this is something that Trisha Hershey talks a lot about accessibility. Like she is kind of against retreat centers, because they're exclusive, and that not everyone, someone that is a single mom with 3 kids or working an hourly job, right, isn't able to take an expensive retreat. And so how can we offer places and create sacred, safe places? And I think churches can do that abundantly if we would open our buildings and we became places of rest and recreation opposed to judgment and irrelevance, right? And then that's a gift that we could have.
Listen, I see this new idea flourishing for a mission church is that it's not quite a spa church, but it definitely has nap pods in it.
It is, and I love it. Like, I think I would love. I think we have urban renewal possibilities where people are living and working, and I like that when I visit Europe or other places that, my sister lived in Italy for a long time, and the churches are open. I don't know if they're open 24 hours, but it's like 11 o'clock. We're walking home from a restaurant or something, and then you can just pop in and light a candle and say a prayer. And it's a beautiful thing, kind of these holy cathedrals, right? And so I just wonder, how can we help kind of reclaim some sacred space? And take a nod from the National Park Service and the state parks, right? That if you don't make space to be sacred, then it will be developed for just another strip mall, right? And God calls us to live a life of intention, and sometimes that means less, right?
Yeah. Actually, was just having a conversation earlier today with someone where just kind of talking about like some finances thing, and I said, listen, like, I'm not in a field, like, I'm never gonna make a lot of money. That's not what I am destined to do. I was like, and people in my field who are not doing something that they should probably, like, or they're doing something they probably shouldn't.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting coming from you, because you have a business background, so you could have you were set up at a very young age to become, quite financially wealthy.
Well, I took a huge pay cut to go and work in Lutheran campus ministries. That's about
exactly.
We
chose a different path.
Every once in a while, my spouse reminds me of that. She's like, "What happened to like this finance thing where you were gonna like make lots of money?" My soul. That's what happened.
I know. It's something I talk about with students all the time, because
also not that if you're gifted and that's your that you feel is your vocation and your calling, because those things are important.
100%. We need ethical people in every field.
Yes.
In every, without a doubt. But when I have students that, like, their first year out are already making more money than I make. And so then we say, okay, what are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with your power?
I was at a friend's house recently who has like some preteen kids, and they're not called chores. They're called home responsibilities, and everyone has home responsibilities. But in a preteen age, you complete your home responsibilities or you do a certain amount, then you get some money. And they split it evenly. They get $15, and every time that they receive $15 when they've earned it, they had to put five of it goes into their spending. They can spend it on whatever they want. 5 of it goes to give, and 5 of it goes to save. So 1/3 of their income goes to, they get to pick whatever charity they want, but it has to be given away.
Yeah.
I thought that was a good ratio. I was like, wow, that is a good way to, we're already teaching at a young age, sort of this idea of giving in this way.
Yeah. Well, it's huge, because I got to say, it's a lot easier to start giving away at that age than all of a sudden what 10% of your income is later in life.
Yeah.
There's a lot more zeros, right, that go with that. And so, yeah, we just did a big appeal to help the the shelter ministry, that we have a joint Lutheran Episcopal Cruzada Fronteras is what it's called. And this is our Lent campaign. And I was on the students, I was like, we have made this, and they're like, oh, we can't possibly, our goal is $1,000. Like, we can't possibly do this. And I was like, okay, but how much money are you spending on coffee? And how much money are you, going out to eat with your friends and this and that? And they're like, they seem like little simple pleasures, but it's the practice as much as it is the money, right? Like just giving up one of those kind of self-indulgences a week so that, and in this case, literally someone could be fed and have safe shelter before they pass through this kind of traumatic passage. And so anyway, it's some years we do better than others, right? And but I think
well, yeah,
God,
that's why like this like magical 10% is not, written on a stone somewhere. Like it's you always hear that it's designed to help foster what giving and being generous looks like. Again, because we follow Jesus, and that's what is the root of why we do the things that we do.
Right.
Like your student that like they're doing social justice because of these things.
Right.
To use really Lutheran language, which, I probably do at least once an episode because I had to memorize the Book of Concord like everyone else. We don't do good works to earn the gift of salvation. It is because of this gift and because we follow Jesus, that our faith cannot help but to do these good works incessantly, that we give in response to this gift.
Yeah. So I have a friend that just took her church, like 90 people to the Holy Lands to walk in the way of Jesus, and which is an incredible, powerful thing. But almost a third of them asked if they could upgrade their plane tickets on the group travel ticket. And it is like, I was so surprised and a little horrified. And that's the rub, right? I want to go learn about Jesus, but could I please sit in business class and not have a middle seat, right? And I know that there's any number of reasons why people do this, but I think that really that was just a really good, like, kind of telling example of like there is a cost to this discipleship, right? And
to check what that is, right? Like this is when we see, this guy a few years ago did this like expose on like multi-million-dollar, evangelical pastors. Like he did it basically, what's this pastor wearing, right? Like, $500 shoes and things like that, like on stage, right? Like this is what, or like I think about like, when the huge hurricane happened in the Gulf, like like a 1,000,000-foot complex that Joel Osteen's church, but they would not open it to, people that, to those that are, fleeing, that are, refugees at the moment, right? Like they're not even like foreign refugees. These are like people that live down the street, like,
right.
Or I had just comments on different churches of like, I think like if Jesus himself were to show up, would he be allowed? Would he be welcome? Would you, how many times have you slammed the door in Jesus's face?
Yeah. I think I'll go back to like kind of Father Greg Boyle and what he said. He said, we just have made this overly complicated, and we just need to care about the things that Jesus cared about, which was compassion and feeding, listening, healing. Right. That's it. And that was really inspiring for me. And I understand that like in campus ministry, I have a little more latitude than a lot of congregations do. But I think our greatest calling, and I think that's often what younger leaders are saying to kind of boomers in the church, is to say like preserving the institutional church is not the call, right? The call is to proclaim radical, inclusive love in the name of Jesus. and to build community around that, right? And that is not about preserving an institution. And that's real. I feel like we're in this great reckoning right now, where in that the choice to preserve the institution, the buildings above all else is it's really heartbreaking. It's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, I agree. Of like, what do we think we're sharing the good news for? And I think it's fine. I now know what that sound is, and I hope that it shows up in this recording, and that other people also get to experience Payla's delightful afternoon nap. No, I think it's something that, like, I think Paul would agree, right? Like his whole thing, in even as abrasive as he can be in his sharing of the message, he's sharing it because he truly, with his whole heart, right? Like this is we're sharing this thing about this good news.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we reflect on this every year on Christ the King Sunday, right? That who is our King and what does that look like? And I think if you have spent any time in our tradition, that you should recognize that we don't believe, right, in this all powerful. Well, I shouldn't say all powerful, but right, this emperor king, right? But instead we believe in a humble Palestinian that came into the world with a simple family and was able to transform us through acts of mercy and compassion in seeing the least, the last, and the lost, right? And that doesn't come with emperor robes. And anytime that we go into that space, I think we just have to remember our theology of the cross, right? And how we are not believers of theology of glory, right? And that kind of exaltation is not really where we meet Jesus. We meet Jesus in the brokenness of the world and the brokenness of our lives. And that is a God that's worth staking my life for.
Yeah. Your sort of airplane thing about this trip and wanting to upgrade seats, I think about, like, where would Jesus be sitting on the airplane?
Oh my goodness. I mean, last row next to the bathroom, right? Passing out water. Maybe turning water into wine.
I think he'd be in the jump seat of the flight attendant, right? Like that's the role that Jesus would have on the flight, right? Like that's putting himself between, him and the guy that doesn't want to wear their mask, or the person that's having a panic attack and trying to, I don't know, leave. Anyways, yeah, I might be slightly off topic, but I love how, just drawing into, again, this message of what the gospel truly is and what is happening and being shared.
Amen. So we don't see this immediately after this passage in Acts, but I think ultimately the Luke Acts Paul, shall we call him, is also wanting to pull people out of the intellectual banter and into the community, right? And so, I mean, because I feel like that is very real in Luke. The focus on the people and the healing stories and the feeding stories and all those kinds of things, right? And so just kind of debating religion in the public square is not enough, right? That's not.
Well, and like, I think he got pulled into the square. Right. And so it's a different, honestly, it almost reminded me a lot of like how kind of like Jesus got kind of put, like people were like basically like putting him in the middle of stuff for him to, to talk. And so it kind of reminded me of one of those moments a little bit. We're like, well, I guess while I'm here.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it makes for a good story, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I have run out of things to throw at my dog to wake him up so that you won't hear
That's
the
fine. You know what? We will call it a day and let Palo keep going with his nap.
Yes.
Thanks so much for joining us on this fun episode and for, indulging me in doing a little bit more research on a passage we don't talk about enough.
Well, it's great to be with you, AJ. And shout out to the whole pod community. Thanks for listening to us today. Glad to be with you.
If you're new with us, remember that you can learn more at 10footpolepodcast.com and find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10footpolepodcast, and really wherever you listen to podcasts. The 10-Foot Pole Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care.